I want to take up the subject of the enigma of anti-Semitism, history and theology. I have an interest in Jewish history, many of you know, and anti-Semitism is possibly the central question of Jewish history. It is pernicious, it is persistent, it is long-standing. It has accompanied the Jewish people in our journey throughout history from the earliest days. As we said, Arami, Ovei, Avi, even my first father, according to some, was Abraham, was a wandering Aramean, and according to the well-known tradition, Rashi was an Aramean who sought to destroy my father, our father, Yaakov Avinu. So it goes back to the earliest stages of our peoplehood. And even though anti-Semitism sometimes waxes and wanes, and sometimes it seems to be maybe somnolescent for a while, but anti-Semitism is a light sleeper. It is easily aroused. So let's see if we can, against the odds, complete this outline in the short time we have together. And certainly I would like to finish in timely fashion, so we can daven and break the fast out in the marquee. So the background to this talk, even though, as I just indicated, sadly, it is an appropriate topical subject at any time and throughout our history. But of course, the stimulus, especially now, is the background of this Torah massacre, the events in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iran, and really the events in the college campuses and elsewhere throughout the Western world and beyond. So anti-Semitism has definitely reared its head once more. Why anti-Semitism? So here I want to address head-on the question, the conundrum, the enigma of anti-Semitism. And I want to propose some naturalistic explanations and some theological explanations, which of course can only be regarded as tentative because certainly I don't have an insight into the mind of God, but we have some basis on which we can advance some theories. But let's talk about the naturalistic explanation. We can call that al-derech hateva. The Jews are bearers of divine truth and other religions are misguided. This is the conviction that Judaism has brought to the world. Remember that paganism, polytheism, is inherently pluralistic, by which I mean that if someone has a few gods and his neighbor has a few other gods, they can get together and have more gods together. You know, the pantheon has a number of gods, and if you need to add or trade in or borrow or lend a few gods from time to time according to the events of the wars and conquest and that sort of thing, usually to a great extent the pagans were prepared to mix and match. I'm not saying they enjoyed being conquered and that sort of thing, but if they felt that they were conquered by a foreign nation, it means the other God was stronger than our God. So why should we worship our God? He's a loser. We'll worship the God of the winner, and we'll get along to get along. So but Judaism introduced to the world a different perspective, a different approach in which there's one God. He's our God, and he's the God of the entire world. And all of these pagan gods who compete with one another, who rob one another, maim one another, steal one another, abduct their wives and that sort of thing, like you have in the Greek and the Roman mythology, all of that is nonsensical. That's what Abraham Avinu taught the world, and that's what the Jewish people have stood for. But that is not always going to be a popular point of view. As I said, if we say that others are misguided, then we're going to naturally arouse the hostility of those who don't like our criticism. Even though Jews have normally not been aggressive in that way. Within the land of Israel, yes, but we haven't sought to impose the Jewish faith on foreign nations, which of course they have sought to impose their religion upon us. But nevertheless, this is our message, and it hasn't always been a popular one. So I think this is one factor. And by the way, I just want to observe that the suggestions I want to advance are in addition to, and I would suggest these are the underlying causes. Many have observed that anti-Semitism is a result of xenophobia, of racism, of a fear of the other, of economic concerns, of the need for a scapegoat, and all of that is true. And in many cases, instances of anti-Semitic outbursts can be understood in those terms. But it's my contention that those are factors which exacerbate anti-Semitism, which explain or contribute to the flaring up of anti-Semitic outbursts, but they don't reflect the root cause of anti-Semitism. And I would go further and say that the error of some observers, some historians, some scholars, even some who may be sympathetic to Judaism, but they de-Judaize anti-Semitism. They try to explain it in terms of why other people may hate other people, but that doesn't necessarily explain anti-Semitism itself. For example, economic reasons. The Jews have been accused of being unproductive parasites, and they've been accused of being rapacious capitalists who are exploiting the proletariat. So, and there may be instances where the circumstances give rise to each of those critiques, but the fact that they are contradictory just indicate that they change according to circumstances. But our suggestions that we're advancing this evening are factors which are a characteristic of Judaism itself. So that's one thing. The Jews are bearers of divine truth, and other religions are misguided. Then we have the idea of the chosen people, the notion that the Jews are chosen, which is explicit in the Torah. Now, we don't believe that Jews have the only path to salvation. On the contrary, whereas many other religions do maintain such a position, and they insist that others have to convert to their religion in order to be considered worthy in the eyes of God. Judaism does not advance that position. However, we do maintain that we have a unique relationship with Hashem. He gave us the Torah. He made us into the eternal nation. He gave us a mission to fulfill on earth. And that special relationship brings with it special responsibilities, but it also elevates us to a position of importance within the divine scheme. Again, that is not going to, elicit approbation necessarily or applause from the nations of the world. So the chosenness of the Jewish people is a factor that has, as I say, stimulated and is a cause for anti-Semitism. But there's something else which is sometimes overlooked, and that is the better quality of life. And I don't mean because of affluence, because Jews are upper middle class and others are maybe struggling blue collar workers. I don't mean that at all. As I'm sure you know, many times in Jewish history, the Jews have not been economically advantaged at all, just the opposite. They've been excluded from the nobility, they've been excluded from the landed gentry, they've been excluded from the guilds, they've been excluded from most ways of earning a living other than petty trade and money lending, and some others. I don't want to suggest that no Jew ever earned a living in another way, but classically Jews were subjected to many forms of economic deprivation. So I'm not talking about economics. I'm talking about that the Jews had better quality of life within themselves. Education. Jews educated their children, not only their sons, but even their daughters. There's a fascinating testimony of an anonymous student of Peter Abelard, a theologian, contemporary of Rashi in France. And he was critiquing the Catholics. And he says that if a man has sons or daughters, he puts them to work in order to enrich the family, bottom line. He says, but if a Jew has children, he puts them all to letters, and not only his sons, but even his daughters. Which is an interesting comment, because classically, we don't find that girls in Europe or generally were educated in medieval times, and Jewish girls perhaps as well. But this is a testimony that suggests that perhaps they were, I say educated. I'm not saying they were scholars in every case, probably not, but they were at least literate, which most of the peasantry were not. In fact, not just the peasantry, even the middle class were not literate. The clergy who were literate. In the Jewish world, even a cheder boy of 3 or 4. Ruth and I are proud of our son Simcha. He taught himself to read when he was 3 years old. Normally a child takes today, so it takes a Jewish child till he's 4 or 5. I'm not saying Jewish child children are more gifted necessarily, but the parents value education, whether it's Aleph Beis Gimel, whether it's more sophisticated ability, Ben Chamesh LeMikra, Ben Eser LeMishnah. Jews have valued education, and that's, I'm sure, for theological reason, because the Torah is holy, and it's a mitzvah to study the Torah and to develop one's ability to reason. Certainly, a yeshiva student needs to hone his intellect in order to understand the Talmudic discussions. But even at a more basic level, possibly if a person is living on the edge of society in terms of economic life, in terms of security, he could be driven from his home at any time. He may not be able to take with him his wealth or his property, but he can take his mind. He can take with him his intellectual capacity. So maybe that is a factor. But for whatever the reasons, education has always characterized Jewish life, family stability as well. And again, it doesn't mean that there's that every Jewish family, is lives in absolute harmony with the parents and the children. But compared to the wider society, Jewish family stability has been an aspect of the quality of life which has probably aroused the envy and therefore the hostility of those around us. Maharam Rothenberg writes in the 13th century, Rabbi Meir of Rothenberg, I mentioned him the other day in one of the shiurim, I think, that he writes in a tshuva, Lo nahug etzleinu lahakos es hanashim kamo etzel hagoyim. It's not customary in our community to beat the women the way the nations of the world do. It was a common it was a common phenomenon. The rule of thumb, the expression rule of thumb derives from the fact that a man was not allowed to beat his wife with a rod thicker than his thumb. So if you marry a diminutive guy, then it's better than if you marry a big hole.
That's okay.
It was okay. I'm not saying it was necessarily approved in law, but it was part of the sort of accepted circumstance of life. I don't mean to say that every Christian family, every woman lived in fear of her husband's wrath, but Jewish family life was characterized by a greater level of respect and decency and human dignity. And this, again, is a factor that probably contributed to the arousing of envy and jealousy. But here's one that's my favorite, and that's communal self-help. This has characterized Jewish life from earliest antiquity. The Rambam writes in Hilchos Matnos Anim, Me'olam lo ra'inu v'lo shamanu al kehila b'Yisrael she'enen kupas tzedakah. He said, we've never seen or heard of a Jewish community without a communal charitable fund. The idea of communal self-help, it doesn't mean only helping another Jew who's in need because he's impoverished and he's hungry and he has nothing to wear. That's true as well. But it even means helping a person to get a start in life, giving him a Gemilas Chesed loan so that he can set up in business. The way that we help one another, and Jews have been driven from place to place historically, so many times they frequently had to start in a new place. And I know I've told this story before, but there are some new faces here that when my father came to West Lafayette, Indiana in 1960, he was offered a position at Purdue University. Thankfully, he was not impoverished, but after a year or two, he wanted to buy a house. And he went to the bank to get a mortgage, and the house cost, I think, whatever it was, that's not important. And he met with the bank manager, and the bank manager said, we can arrange a loan for you. We can see you're employed by Purdue University. And do you have any other outstanding debts? Because, we can incorporate it into the loan. You can pay off your debts, and we'll give you a competitive rate. So my father said, I only have one debt. It's to the Lafayette Gemilas Chesed Fund for $500. Now, 1960, $500 is not a trivial amount, but obviously it was a lot less than the cost of the house. So the manager said, look, we can pay off the $500 and we give you a competitive rate. So my father said, no, you don't understand. This is a Lafayette Hebrew Free Loan Society. It's an interest-free loan. You can't give me a better rate. So his eyes opened wide and he said, Dr. Simon, he said, where do you get an interest-free loan? It's anathema to a banker, an interest-free loan. So my father said that Jewish communities from earliest antiquity have always established a method of helping those new arrivals who want to get started in life or get started in business. And, it's a free loan. So I took out a free loan for $500. So he said, Dr. Simon, if I became Jewish, could I get a free loan? My father said, you probably could, but it's not worth it. But this exemplifies the communal self-help, the impulse for communal self-help. And again, thankfully, we are living in prosperous times and safe times, despite the context of our discussion this evening. But it wasn't long ago historically when our forebears, probably two, maybe three generations in some cases, for me, it's my grandparents who came from Eastern Europe, came to America. And, they were not educated in the classic sense. They were not fluent speakers of English, and they came with very limited resources. And that it characterizes Jewish life for centuries. And we came to America, again, it's not me or my parents, my grandparents, but I remember they came to America with very limited resources. There were others who came to America also, the Irish, the Italians, etc. Within a generation, the Jews had, in most cases, elevated themselves well above out of the poverty category, and many did quite well for themselves, certainly in relative terms. So what do the other disadvantaged minority groups feel about the Jews who have left them behind, in the ghetto and are now living on the Upper East Side or something like that? Well, it is uneasy to understand how such circumstances, I don't say such behavior because we don't want to fault the Jewish people for doing things which are actually praiseworthy. But nevertheless, we can understand how these circumstances can tend to arouse anti-Semitism. And although I'm talking about 20th century events, but this characterizes Jewish life throughout the many, many centuries. I want to turn, of course, now to a theological explanation, which, as I said, of course, can only be tentative. For one thing, there's a very famous statement, and Rashi quotes it, Esav Sonei leYaakov, halacha b'yadua. It is part of the rhythm of the human experience, certainly the Jewish experience, Esav Sonei leYaakov. Esav here exemplifies those, basically the nations of the world, but Esav is the brother of Yaakov, he's the antagonist of Yaakov. Later on in rabbinic sort of typology, Esav represents the Roman Empire, later represents the Christian church. Esav Sonei leYaakov. The Gemara also has a famous drash about the word Sinai. Sinai is the mountain where the Torah was given. It's related to the word Sinah. The Gemara suggests a drash. It really comes to the word sneh, probably, which means a bush. But in the drash, Sheyarda Sina Lumos Ha'olam, hatred came down to the world on the part of the nations of the world against the Jewish people. It's because of the Sinai experience. The world has never forgiven us for giving them the Torah. So this is one aspect which is, I guess, a bit depressing if we consider that it's somehow an enduring, intractable feature of the human experience, anti-Semitism. There's another perspective, and this is also famous, found in our liturgy many times, because of our sins, and we say that in the Tefillah, and we refer to that, we allude to that idea on Tisha B'Av, certainly, and even in the Slichos that we said today as well, reflecting on the way in which the Jewish people were rebuked or punished by as a sort of reflection of divine disfavor. One can question whether the Jewish people are really so iniquitous. Like one of the Hasidic Rebbes said, we may not be all completely angelic, but which other nation is more meritorious? Which other nation is more holy, is more deserving? Okay, but Hashem evidently holds us to an exacting standard. And like it says, Assyria, the rod of my anger, Ashur Shevet Api, that Hashem, so to speak, utilized these nations, whether Babel or Ashur or other nations, possibly Rome, and maybe subsequently, as a vehicle, as the means by which the Jewish people were punished in accordance with the divine plan. There may be another angle as well, and hopefully we'll get to that before we finish. Okay, I want to just briefly consider, because I want to talk about some of the history as well, some of the examples of anti-Semitism. I have it here in number 3, time immemorial. So among the pagans, in a way, as I said, the pagans did not have a particular gripe against Judaism. It's just that they didn't like that we didn't accept their various gods, and we said there's only one God, and we're not going to agree to accept the introduction of Greek gods or Roman gods into our belief system. And certainly Jews were persecuted in the pagan world. More, let's say, closer to our like historical awareness is Christian anti-Semitism. The Christians had, in their mind at least, a good reason. They had a gripe with the Jews because we were responsible for killing Oso Ha'ish. And although it's not clear historically whether the Jews executed him, whether the Romans did it, crucifixion was not a Jewish form of execution. The Gemara seems to indicate that maybe they did execute him because Jesus may have been one of any number of sectarian firebrands, sort of charismatic leaders, but we'll have to say that for a different time. Suffice to say, the Christians felt very aggrieved that the Jews are still around, especially because the whole idea, and again, I'm not going to delve into it, but the whole idea of the New Testament is that the Old Testament has been superseded. If the Christians are the new Jews, and the Hashem, the God of Israel, rejected the Jews because we rejected Jesus, then why are we still around? And this was a problem for them. This is a thorn in the side of the church for a long, long time, even to the point that they adopted a kind of doctrine of the wandering Jew, in which they said that actually the Jews are supposed to be still around, impoverished, reviled, marginalized, demonized, in order to teach the faithful Christian what happens if you, don't behave. If the Jews were to be completely annihilated, then this object lesson, we wouldn't have that opportunity. It was probably an ex post facto justification because they were not successful in essentially converting the Jews or killing them all. They were not successful, so they had to derive some kind of an explanation for the phenomenon. We find this in the writings of Ambrose and other of the church elders. Again, I don't want to dwell that much on Christian theology. The medieval conception of the Jew was we have the idea of what's called servi camere, where the Jews were the like personal property of the crown. The servi camere means serfs of the chamber. So the church wanted to drive out the Jews or convert them, but the crown, the king or the nobility found them useful. So the Jews were caught between the two, but sometimes they could play them off one against the other as well. The Jews were caught in the middle of the church, church state struggle. And we find the medieval metaphor of the Jews as a sponge. The Jews who soak up the money from the business community by money lending or business enterprises, and then they're squeezed dry in extortionate taxation by the crown. And because church law did not allow Christians to lend money at interest, but an economy cannot function without extending interest. Dr. Schmidt is not here at the moment. He's a resident professor of economics or finance. I'm sure he'll confirm that. So they needed capital. The kings needed capital more than anybody, by the way, to wage wars and for other kinds of projects. So they either borrowed from the Jews, or better yet, they stole from the Jews. They extorted from the Jews. And anyway, we find that the Jews were caught between, as I said, both the two forces. Forms of anti-Semitism were taxation, economic deprivation, continuous humiliation, ghettos, forced conversions, torture, massacre, and expulsion. And each of those terms could be a talk unto itself, for which certainly we don't have time. I want to say a word about Muslim anti-Semitism. Today, we are very conscious of Muslim anti-Semitism. It requires no elaboration. Classically, though, if we look at the sweep of 1,000 years and more, the Jews have been persecuted by the Christians and tolerated by the Muslims. Doesn't mean we've been celebrated or accommodated or appreciated by the Muslims, but we've generally been tolerated, usually as second or third class citizens. But the virulence and the hostility, the violent hostility of the Christians against the Jews has usually surpassed that of the Muslims. It's partly because, as I said, the Christians have a gripe against the Jews. The fact that the Jews continue to exist actually gives the lie to their whole religion, and it has for the last nearly 2,000 years. They've got a problem with it. So it's very difficult for them to overcome it. I've got no sympathy for them, but that is, in theological terms, the Muslims don't have that particular problem. On the contrary, the Muslims recognize that Judaism has much to offer, and for that matter, much of the Quran comes from the Torah and the Tanakh and the Talmud as well. By the way, the best parts of the Quran come from the Talmud. And it always irks me when I hear the Muslim clerics on the radio or elsewhere saying that in the Quran it says that one who saves a life has saved the whole world. The one who kills one person has killed the world. And they say that by way of explaining how Islam is such a peaceful and religion and such so humanitarian. Of course, that comes from the Gemara in Sanhedrin, was taken. I mean, Islam is a much more recent development. Islam is not nearly as ancient as Judaism and not as ancient as Christianity even. Muhammad was only born in, I think, 632. And so, he was Johnny come lately, and he had to sort of look around to find some clever words of wisdom to put into the Quran. What he found in the Torah, how he found in the New Testament, and he took from the Mishnah and from the Gemara as well. But anyway, so the point is the Muslims have generally not had a whole lot of sympathy or admiration for the Jews. Also, Muhammad thought that the Jews would follow him because he was rejecting paganism, teaching a pure monotheism, and he was hoping the Jews would all support him. By the way, Luther had the same idea in the Reformation. That's why Martin Luther also thought the Jews would support him because he was undermining Catholicism. But when it didn't happen, he turned on the Jews as well. So we find that in terms of religious anti-Semitism, there's plenty of it. I've got here selected persecutions. You may or may not be pleased here. We don't have time for selected persecutions. So we're going to go on to number 5, from religious anti-Semitism to racial anti-Semitism. So all of this talk about the religious basis for anti-Semitic hatred and violence and, as I said, torture and massacre and blood libel and that sort of thing, you might have hoped, and I'm sure that there are many, many Jews who did hope, that as the power of the church waned, and as the era of enlightenment dawned, and as the grip of the church on the mind and on the lives of the European populace began to weaken, that there was a hope for the Jews to emerge from this dark, bitter shadow of persecution. And this was the Enlightenment, and this was the emancipation. And there were many Jews who were hopeful of that. Unfortunately, religious anti-Semitism gave way to a more virulent and violent form of anti-Semitism, which is racial anti-Semitism. Someone once wrote a fascinating essay, Yitzhak Ber, one of the great Jewish historians of the 19th century, early 20th century, and he wrote an essay called Bein Tatnu Latach V'Tat, which to the average reader means nothing. Tatnu is Taf Nun Vav, refers to the First Crusades. Tach V'Tat refers to the Chmielnicki massacres, which actually are on the selective persecution list. The Chmielnicki massacres were in 1648, 1649. We call them Xeris Tach V'Tat because those are the Jewish years. And the essay essentially said that the First Crusades were a time of unprecedented suffering for the Jewish people. We still remember it on Tisha B'Av and other days. Even today, we would call the martyrdom of the First Crusades. But that was pure religious persecution. The Chmielnicki massacre did not have the same religious angle. It was more economic opportunism. It was more the sadistic bestiality of the Russian Cossacks of the time, a time of unspeakable atrocities. I don't want to dwell upon, we don't have time for it anyway. And that was the beginning of that shift from a purely religious persecution to persecution that transcended religious considerations. By the late 1800s, religious anti-Semitism began to give way to racial anti-Semitism, what was known as eugenics. The idea that the Jewish people are not just a religion, but they are a race, and they need to be, in the mind of Hitler, killed out entirely as a race. So unfortunately, racial anti-Semitism endured even when the grip of religion was no longer as firm within the European mindset. Again, we don't have time to elaborate further because I do want to be sure to get to number 8. So let's talk about number 6 for the moment. Since 1967, racial anti-Semitism has also gotten a bad name because of the Holocaust, and racism generally has rightfully been appreciated for the evil that it is. So if religious anti-Semitism is no longer in vogue, racial anti-Semitism is politically incorrect. So what's left? We got something new, political anti-Semitism. This is anti-Zionism masquerading, or rather anti-Semitism masquerading as anti-Zionism, or as I've written here on the outline, anti-Zionism as a fashionable form of anti-Semitism. So now Arab and Muslim anti-Semitism is predicated on politics, especially in recent years. It's based on the concern for the well-being of the Palestinians, even though for many, many years, the Arabs had very little interest in the Palestinians. They could have easily absorbed the Palestinian refugees many, many decades ago. They don't have a special great sympathy for them, and they're not very much inclined to help them. But it suits their purposes very well now because it enables the Palestinians to emerge as the international media darlings, and the state of Israel to be portrayed as the aggressor and the violent, rapacious military force. It takes the form, it says in letter B, UN resolutions, condemnation, standing committees devoted exclusively to condemning Israel, UNRWA, special reports that are issued with depressing regularity. And of course, especially in the last few years, because the resolutions of the UN have been with us for decades, but now we have the DBS, divest, boycott, sanction, campus protests and intimidation, calls to globalize the Intifada, and more. There's been a bit of pushback against that, as we know, with the developments in America and American politics, but this is the current state of affair. Militant secularism is a factor as well, and that is possibly a companion to and a fellow traveler of the political anti-Semitism, where Judaism is now criticized for being a religion itself, because Judaism gave rise to Christianity. So the militant secularists, they don't like Christianity, they don't like religion, and therefore they focus on Judaism, which in their view has underlies or has given rise to the religions that they so criticize and revile. So we find the militant secularists also have joined the party of the latest, most current fashion of anti-Semitism. I want to get in the 5 minutes we have left to an evaluation, which I think to me is the most important part. Firstly, the failure of anti-Semitism is the most remarkable thing to me. The more, like it says in the beginning of Shmos, the more they oppressed them, the more they proliferated and spread. That which characterizes Egyptian persecution of our ancestors, who came as an extended family of 70 souls and grew to many tens, hundreds of thousands, and were enslaved, again, as we very well know, they did not succeed in stamping out the Jewish people at that time. On the contrary, in accordance with the persecution, so was the increase of the Jewish people. And this has characterized anti-Semitism from that day onward. I'm not saying that the Jews have flourished in the face of anti-Semitism, but we have found resources, we have found energy, creativity, tenacity to survive and even to thrive despite the anti-Semitism. In fact, we find sometimes the opposite. In the absence of anti-Semitism, Jewish life withers on the vine. In America, when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, there was much talk about the okay, I was only born in 1961. What I'm describing probably was a little bit earlier than that. It was like in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. In the middle decades of the 20th century, the expectation that Judaism actually is going to disappear entirely, especially Orthodox Judaism, because the alembic, the sort of effect, the calming, like trance-inducing effect of American prosperity, the American dream, is effectively depriving Judaism of its oxygen, because Judaism seems to thrive on hostility. If there's no hostility, then why be Jewish even? And ironically, for a lot of Jews, it's anti-Semitism which reminds them of who they are. And that takes us to the irony of anti-Semitism. Just very briefly, Oxford, we got Robert of Reading, who went to Oxford in 1222. He went to study in Oxford University. The curriculum at Oxford University in 1222 was essentially one thing, theology. So he was studying to be a priest. But he took an interest in Judaism and he converted to Judaism, and they burned him at the stake as a result. So in 1221, they set up a priory in the Jewish quarter in Oxford so that the friars, by their exemplary courage and gift of preaching, would convert the Jews to Christianity. And when one student called Robert of Reading came to Oxford and became Jewish, they burned him at the stake. What kind of advertisement is that for Christianity? I mean, if it's religion of love and all of that, what kind of advertisement? And I'm not saying that the Jews were sort of contented to be oppressed and taxed and exploited by the authorities, but nevertheless, when the consequence of converting to Judaism means burning at the stake, Jews thought, you know what? If that's what that religion is about, I've got no interest in it. Inquisition and its prisons, a certain person was quoted saying, the school where I was taught the knowledge of God. The absurdity of the blood libel. This is an answer was made by Achad Ha'am, the famous Hebrew writer. Achad Ha'am, what Jew could ever believe a blood libel? Not just the learned people in this room right now, but what Jew anywhere could believe that it was Jewish practice to abduct and murder a Christian child and use his blood to bake matzah? Is there ever any Jew anywhere, unless he was completely deranged, who could believe such a thing? It's so absurd, the absurdity and the fact that our enemies did believe it to murderous consequence. But again, it highlights the failure of anti-Semitism and the irony of anti-Semitism, because the absurdity of it. I put here Jenny Tom, I don't know if she's still living, I haven't heard from her recently, thankfully, when they had that terrible floods in Haiti, and Israel sent special medics and rapid response teams. They saved so many lives then. And she said, the IDF has gone to harvest the organs of some of the black people to use it for whatever purpose. I mean, it's so distasteful, it's nauseating, but again, it shows us the absurdity and the obsessive, irrational hatred that others have for us. It was a 21st century echo of the medieval blood libel. And Nazism, they said that the Jews, like we mentioned before, because of the eugenics and the racial, paradigms, the Jews are subhumans. But any objective observer who contemplates how the Nazis killed the Jews, the ways in which they killed them. So who were the subhumans? Not that that is a Jewish category, subhuman, but if the Nazis have popularized it. So, I'm not saying that a Jew would say, yeah, I'd rather be murdered than be a murderer. Okay, maybe so. I don't mean to be cavalier, but I'm just saying, look at it objectively. Who were the subhumans? So the failure of anti-Semitism is, to me, the most remarkable thing. And today, I'm going to end with this, for this time to David Marv. Today, anti-Semitism is a stimulant to Jewish identity. And I've written Devorah Simon, that is our beloved daughter-in-law, who lives in Baltimore. And she is the national director of JSU, Jewish Student University. It is an outreach program. Jewish Student Union. I'm sorry, thank you. It's Jewish Student Union for high school students who go to public schools, which the great majority of American Jewish kids go to public schools. Not like public schools here, which are really private schools, but public schools, as opposed to Jewish schools. And they had clubs for them nationwide. And she said they have seen an enormous outpouring of interest and desire to identify and to affiliate, to learn more about Judaism, to be with Jews, to have Jewish activities, Jewish knowledge, Jewish understanding as a direct consequence of the wave of hostility that was unleashed after the Simchas Torah massacre of October 2023. So these are some preliminary thoughts within the limited time under not the most ideal circumstances. We're all hungry and wanted out of Mark. But thank you, gentlemen, for attentiveness, for staying awake. And thank you again to Daniel for his IT support.